Well, we should be streaming now. We should be on our third season of the Pay Practitioners panel, if I can remember the name. I want to say thank you guys for taking some time over the next several months to share your wisdom, share your knowledge, share your experience in compensation. For those that don't know, or for those that it's their first time to see the Pay Practitioners panel, what we are is we're a group of compensation consultants who have blocked out an hour of our calendars every other Friday to talk about all things compensation related. It's an unrehearsed, unscripted, and informal conversation. And today, to get to know everybody, one of the things we're going to do is take questions from the audience. So we like to say, stump the compensation consultant. And we're going to limit the number of it depends to just a handful of times. I think Paul had a note on that I saw. So as we get started, we'll go ahead and we'll just introduce everybody. I'll start with myself. I'm Justin Hampton. I am the founder of CompTool. I was a compensation practitioner for about 15 years, working for companies like Starbucks, Big Fish Games, and a handful of others before I started the compensation software, CompTool, which features Squirrel. I like to talk about all things related to technology, benchmarking, and things of that nature, and how we are streamlining the compensation analyst platform and things like that. So next, how about James? Why don't you tell us about yourself?
Thanks, Justin. So my name is James Seechurn. I'm at the James Alexander Consulting Group, which is essentially just me. So I've been in this space for around about 15 years now. I spent about the first half of my career was in the UK, working on mostly kind of broad-based and sales comp advisor in Europe and the Middle East. And then a few years later, I moved over to the West Coast, San Francisco, where I've been since the last 8 years now. And I tend to work predominantly with tech and life science companies in the VC-backed space or early public space. And I still tend to work in broad-based compensation and sales comp advisory. Shall I pick someone to go next? Shall I hand it over to someone? I'm going to go ahead, Paul, who's beside me on my screen.
I always have to come after the guy with the accent. Thank you. So nice to meet everybody. My name is Paul Reiman. I'm the founder and managing partner of Novo Insights. We're a boutique comp consulting firm. We're very proud of bridging the gap between comp strategy and comp delivery, particularly focused on kind of the mid-size organization. We have a lot of passion for that. I've been in comp for over 25 years now. That makes me old and makes me having seen a lot. The first dozen years, I was a consultant with big firms. Then I went in-house and ran rewards and op shops for 3 mid-sized tech companies. And then here we are. We're a team of 9 spread around the US and in India, and very excited to be here. I will pass it over to Denise.
Hi, I'm Denise Liebetrau. I'm the founder of a company called Prosper Consulting, and we are passionate about making sure people get paid what they're worth. We do that in 2 ways. One, we work with employers to maximize revenue, impact, and profitability with their compensation programs to attract and retain the right talent. And then 2, I'm a pay negotiation coach. So I teach people how to ask for more money and have careers aligned to their values. And with that, I'm going to pick Shari.
Oh, Shari, I think you're muted.
And my opening line was awesome. I'll try again. Thank you, Denise. I'm Shari Nornes, a principal consultant with Morgan HR. Morgan HR is also a boutique consulting firm. We're based in Chicago. We focus on leaning in on the compensation practice, but we also have 3 other lines of business besides consulting. We have a Simply Merit compensation planning tool. So if you're using spreadsheets, give me a call. We also have Hire Comp, which helps, where we match up compensation professionals with the right employer as we see fit. And then we have, last but not least, Comp Aware, which is where we actually go into organizations and train their leadership team how to have conversations about comp. And in the world of pay transparency, again, call me. So I will pass it on to Rekha.
Thank you, Shari. My name is Rekha. I have been in the compensation space for roughly 15 years. My first 5 years were spent at Radford, doing consulting with large tech companies, and then moved over in-house, and since have been at in compensation roles at Symantec, followed by Atlassian, and most recently I was head of compensation at Box. The last 8 months, I've been working on setting up my own consulting and coaching practice called the Comp Ally. And I do a couple things. I work with predominantly startups and some scale-ups in helping them set compensation strategy, philosophy, market pricing, merit cycles, and things like that. And then also I help people with salary negotiation coaching as well. Generally work with women who are mid to late career, but have all kinds of clients, and help them with negotiating with confidence and kindness is what I try to do. So happy to be here today, and excited to be part of this awesome panel. And I will pass it on to Bobby.
Awesome. Thank you. So Bobby Berkowitz, I'm a managing director at KPMG, part of our people strategy practice, and lead our compensation solution. I've been doing compensation for over a decade and help with executive compensation, broad-based compensation, and Salesforce compensation. Most of our business is within business transformational events. So whether that's M&A, IPO preparation, take private, or other cost optimization, efficiency type projects to help, grow, scale, and maintain businesses. So excited to be part of this panel. So I'll pass it over to Bob. Another great name.
Hey, thanks, Bobby. I appreciate it. My name's Bob Cartwright. I'm founder of a company called Intelligent Compensation. I think I'm the elder of the group. We've been actually doing consulting work for over 28 years now. And prior to that, I served 15 years working for a defense contractor, basically heading global comp over a period of years for them. And then I walked off the curb and have been doing this ever since. We specialize both in for-profit and not-for-profit companies. We're from anywhere from 15, 20,000 employees all the way down to the mom and pop shops. We do a lot of work in the nonprofit space as well. Do a lot of executive comp work for mega churches, private and community foundations, and a whole array of other types of nonprofits, 501c3s, and so on. We also kind of embarked in partnership with an economist on a deal called Componomics, which we're building into that process at this point. Firm believer that economics does have an impact on compensation planning and through performance management. So we do a lot of performance management work as well. And very pleased to be with you here today. And Justin, thanks again for the invite, and Bobby for the introduction.
Oh, great. Well, I think I didn't quite do the math, but I think that's over 150 years of compensation experience in the room, something around there. So, I think that's exciting for today's discussion, because today we wanted to open it up to what do you want to know? So, we are going to be we have a couple of questions that we've received and questions that we will address if we don't have any questions. But we really want you, if you're listening in right now, to go ahead and shoot questions through. So the first one we'll look at, and we've got a couple already. So I like this question. It was from Norma Hingle, and we'll show that up right here. So she's asking us, if we want to advance our career and go from managing compensation programs to contributing to the compensation strategy, could we provide some examples of how we might do that? And I think that's a great opportunity to talk about different career paths, but also how can compensation be a strategic part of the business? So how do you make that influence from the role that you have today? Because that's where we're all starting. So I'll ask if anyone wants to go first with that one.
I can start. We do a lot of work with PE firms and other companies that are going through big changes. And with that, the executive teams are tasked with a lot of strategic decisions around, re-leveling, introducing new job architecture. How does that link to pay? How do you optimize costs? Look at bonus eligibility. And oftentimes it is held fairly close to the vest with the executive team, but they can't do it all themselves. And so where we see a lot of our clients be able to advance in their careers around this is really getting close with the HR leader or another executive to be one of their people that they turn to for that extra analytical support, or to run certain meetings to push this further and program management. And being there to say, yes, I can take this on and help drive it forward, and I see the big picture in what we're trying to accomplish and the level of confidentiality. And a lot of companies are going through this change and dealing with the shift with AI. The market hasn't been great the last couple of years. And so there are these types of projects going on. It's just a matter of gaining the trust from the right folks at your organization so that you can volunteer for leading a lot of these types of strategic changes.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on that as a comp practitioner in-house. I can share some tactical advice that worked for me. Was I would say, if you have an opportunity to work on an M&A transaction, from like taking up the compensation work stream around that, that's a huge way to get just visibility across the organization. You will end up working with functions that you usually wouldn't in your compensation analyst job. And, a lot of people in the company will see you as that face of the compensation team. So for me, that was a game changer when I started kind of becoming that person known around like corporate development, executive leadership. Everybody was like, okay, Rekha is the person we go to with a comp question. And that really kind of helped me level up in my career.
I think one of the things that I found over this period of time that I've been involved in compensation are two things. One is really getting involved in the organization review process when things come up. A lot of executives change. They like the flavor of the month club scenarios. And as a result of that, that creates organization change, which if you get involved on the early end of that, you learn a lot about the business, about how to drive the business to excellence. And you also learn a lot about the people that you're servicing in terms of customer satisfaction. The other piece of that is in terms of driving the business, you really want to be on top of the performance management piece. And by performance management, I'm not talking about performance appraisals. I'm talking about how to measure success in the organization, what's driving the business, and at the end of the day, applying the total rewards process to that so that you're part of the strategy and you're also part of the game plan in terms of executing that strategy and evaluating at the end.
Great. All right, well, that's a great question. Yeah, and lots of great feedback on there. I think let's move to the next one, which I think that there's going to be a few people that want to tackle this one. I know myself will be one of them. But let's see, let me close that one and then we'll bring this up. So I have seen this as well on some of the World at Work World at Work forums and elsewhere. And this talks about the size of the compensation team. I'm actually going to ask Paul to talk through this because Paul has actually done a lot of research on this topic and I think he's running a survey now, I believe. So we'll be able to really kind of talk about what you saw last year, what you're seeing this year, and what is that right number?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to it, right? And as I understand the question, it's not just how many should I have, but it's always feeling understaffed phenomenon. So yeah, a year and a half ago, we benchmarked how big is a comp team relative to the organization. What we found, not surprisingly, is of course it scales up as the organization grows. The bigger the company, the bigger the comp team, but not linearly. It's actually a function of the square root of the employee base, which, kind of an odd mathematical outcome, but it makes sense, right? The next 1,000 people is easier than the first 1,000 people, et cetera. We also saw some industry effects where what we describe high density industries, hospitality, retail, where you've got a lot of people in a relatively small number of roles, your comp team grows at a slower rate than in a type of organization where you have lots of different jobs, right? The employee is not the unit of analysis, it's the job. So that's really what kind of drives the size of your team. The question around like feeling understaffed. So we actually asked that in our research, like, how do you think you are staffed? And what we find is comp teams always lag optimal by like one cycle, right? So that the company has to grow first, then you can justify scaling up the comp team. Company keeps growing, then you scale up. Nobody's going to proactively say, we're going to have another 1,000 people in 2 years. So let's give you those heads now. It just doesn't work that way. So I think we are a lagging function. We are a cost center. Let's remember that. So as a result, our productivity tends to need to come first, right? And then we can sort of justify the resources. Do I love that as an outcome? No. Is that a practical reality? Of course. What I do find though is that comp teams are super creative. Like we're a scrappy bunch at the end of the day, and by use of contractors, which, you know, everybody sort of flies under the radar, you know, technology can make an impact on the margin to make you more productive and absorb that, right? To Shari's point, if you're in spreadsheets, don't, because that's a good way to scale ahead a little bit further. So short version is like, yes, your comp team needs to grow. It's not going to grow before the org grows, and you've got to do some things on the margin to just boost your productivity while you're embracing that that next phase of growth.
Okay. Well, I'd like to address that one as well. And I think that, you know, similar to what Paul, I don't think I actually have anything terribly different to say than Paul. I think what we found is the majority of companies are finding themselves, they feel slightly understaffed. And I think when you look at the ratio of how many employees there are to how many compensation professionals there are, it varies significantly. I've worked for different companies where we had 200,000 employees and 10 compensation people, but 197,000 of those employees were in the same 3 jobs. So that's a very different process to manage that kind of staff versus a very diverse kind of tech company or global company or things like that. So a lot of it will depend upon the size, the complexity, the organization type, the industry, and you know, how you're growing. We're running a poll as well. I'll post the link in there. We've had about 300 companies participate so far, and that should be closing out later today. So we'll get that posted in the link. Anybody else have any? James, I think you had something on that one as well.
Well, yeah, I was actually just looking at one of the other comments by Lindsay that came in as well. Is like, how do you convince or persuade HR or F&A leadership that investing in tools makes sense? And I think it comes back to Paul's point, we're a cost center. So the way to persuade people to invest is to show them that it's going to save them money. So you can position it as headcount growth, or you can position it as investment in tools that over the next year will make the process more efficient, allow us to grow without the need to add significant headcount. That plus some well-chosen consultants perhaps will save you more than adding that headcount across the organization. So and just to go back to the original point, I feel like we've all seen that just doing more with less. It happened a lot over the last few years, it feels like. There's more and more pressure. And I do think comp tools, and Paul did some really good research on all the comp tools that are out there. There is a plethora of tools out there just to streamline that process. And it takes more time to get it right in the first place. But if you kind of plan for that next year, then next year when it comes around, you've got your entire merit cycle, your ranges and your roles, job architecture, nice and tidy, all loaded into a comp tool. It's just a much, much smoother process, and just eliminates all that back and forth that happens if you try and do it in Excel.
One of the things I found too, in terms of this, in short and brief, is sometimes compensation can be a business center. And part of that ties back into the fact that from like an unemployment compensation scenario, you can actually save the company money by being diligent in terms of cost savings related to that. You can also look at it from the strategy perspective. If you're involved in the strategy and you're driving the business and helping drive the business through performance management and incentive planning, both short-term, long-term, you become more of a business center in terms of helping execute the strategies of the organization versus crunching numbers all day. And part of that is actually submitting information back to the head shed in terms of how they might approach and look at executing their strategies and how far you want to drive it down the organization.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add is this is a wrong assumption, but a lot of leaders sometimes think of compensation as just like you just need it once a year, because that's the one time that everybody like sees what compensation team does. So if you're trying to make the case for better staffing of the compensation teams, we have to show them like all year round that it's not just that annual cycle. That's not the only thing that we do as a comp team, and just kind of keep that keep proving your value and like being part of those conversations that some of you all have mentioned already throughout the year. because there's this assumption that it's just a cyclical need once a year, and we'll maybe, just be able to do that with a lean team.
Yeah. And I think you can force your way into being part of those strategic conversations as well, and using the data that you have access to. So you can look at what the turnover has been historically. How have those folks been positioned against your market ranges and salary midpoints, and figure out, is compensation one of the drivers to this, so that as they're thinking through a new strategy, you can also shed light of where potential obstacles may come in getting employee buy-in to change their behaviors or to attract and retain the right talent. And I think, as James and Paul were alluding to, compensation is a cost center, and where can we find savings? There's also the cost avoidance component. And with pay transparency, moving further and further ahead, that is a real cost avoidance for a lot of companies that may not be top of mind for people outside of our fund compensation world, but it's something that they should be aware of. And, you don't want to get slapped with different litigation, lawsuits. The fees associated with that are much more material than investing in some tools and software to help maintain pay equity, alignment to your job architectures, et cetera. And so that can be part of that, burning platform that you're putting forward of the rationale of, and the ROI that you would get.
Great. All right. Well, I think that was unless there's anything else that anyone wants to add on to that one, hop over to one question I think comes up quite a bit. That wasn't the one I meant. Let's see. This was Christopher Thorpe's question. How have you been able to leverage AI to move your organization forward? I also think it's a great question about, how should we be doing that, or what's a great first start with using AI? I mean, we've been talking about this for, a year now, but I got to tell you, everything funny story, like totally not related to comp, but I actually I'm with a bunch of friends traveling, and we all have these bills. We could not find an app we like to split bills. I was able to have ChatGPT build an entire app to split bills. And over the course of about 2 hours, I have no idea how to write code. So just to think about what that means for, how we're going to be managing our business, writing articles or creating content, or, developing policies for comp, like how do you recommend we do that? Or how do you recommend we don't do that? I'll go first. So one of the things that we thought of immediately was using it to write job descriptions, and those things that don't necessarily have to have the greatest level of detail and can have some oversight in terms of editing. I like to think of AI as kind of like an intern. You can use it, you can give it instructions. It's going to try to do what you ask it to do, but it's not always going to be right. And unless you use your experience, your knowledge to really kind of shape and reframe and audit what that intern is doing, it may not be effective. One of the things that I think we will continue to see in softwares is I think, and we were very excited because, hey, cool, we can start doing AI matching of job surveys to your internal jobs. But everybody's already doing that now. It's one of the more incredible technologies that was able to be adapted by a lot of software companies very quickly. I think there's a handful of other points or other things that we can be doing, but I'll open it up for anybody else that wants to comment on that.
I'll comment on that. So you mentioned, Justin, the job description piece, not only to write them, but to help defend them with the leaders. So when they come in with a job description and it has one more bullet point on it, so that has to be a bigger job then. Now it's a promotion. I've often gone into AI and actually compared the two and had a great conversation with the leader about, this really doesn't make it a greater job. It's a little different maybe, but it's not really greater. And to show them it helps spur that fruitful conversation of what really does make a greater job. What makes the job, is it greater or is it just different? Different doesn't mean more necessarily. But so one thing I didn't mention at the beginning was I probably have over 30 years in comp. So we're probably at about 200 years of compensation in this room. So, AI has really made it easier now and not as labor intensive to have those conversations with leaders. So that's one way that I use it quite often.
I use AI every day. And for those of you who follow me on LinkedIn, I am awful at writing my post titles. So I use AI every day when I say, AI, write me these 5 blog post titles, or give me 5 blog post titles. And then I copy the blog post in and it gives me them. I have used them for job descriptions. I have used them for competency and different levels of proficiency. And I have AI running in the background all the time. So I think there's a lot of different ways to utilize it. And certainly companies are experimenting and, developing their own use case for it. But I also think you have to be careful, right? Because hallucinations exist and you can't necessarily trust things because sometimes it makes up stuff. I have one colleague who thinks, AI is never going to become this really big thing because ultimately there's a lot of crazy stuff that's written and it's not necessarily based in fact. And so that downside will always be there. We'll see, right? But I think it can be incredibly valuable from an efficiency perspective. I think it's a tool and a resource. Yes, it'll change some jobs and probably eliminate some, but it'll also create them.
It's interesting you say that, Denise, because I've used it as a business partner. If I'm looking for something that I want to try to explore with a client, and I say, okay, I need 15 questions that are going to hit the point in terms of X, Y, and Z. And they give me those questions and it gives me an insight in terms of maybe something that I've got a gap that I'm missing here. It's very valuable in that regard. And the other is that I can use it also in asking those questions back the other way and utilizing it from a forecasting perspective in terms of what kind of answers am I going to get from this? How do I prepare from that perspective in terms of client need or, just figuring out a game plan in terms of executing the plan or a strategy. I like yourself, I use it every day. And I also use it for graphics because sometimes the graphics can tell a story. I'm notorious for having 100 million things in a slide deck. And so I've actually gone in and said, take the slide deck and knock it down into 15 slides. And I'll be doggone, I'm just shocked at what kind of results come out of it. And I go, well, I could work with that. So those are the kind of things that I think from a technology perspective, it's an excellent resource.
Yeah. The one pro tip, Heidi asked a specific question in there about like specific resources. So you get much better results from a JD generation perspective, as well as job matching, if you pull it out of sort of the public ChatGPT realm and build a custom. So you're using a model, right? But the more resources you can give it specific to you, far less likely you get hallucinations, right? Because it's only learning. I shouldn't say it's only. It is prioritizing learning from what you tell it to learn from, right? So if you have your own leveling criteria, train it on your leveling criteria. It's going to do a much better job of producing those job descriptions. So pro tip is public ChatGPT is not going to be as good as something that you do. It's not hard to create, but something that you create separately. And then the second thing I was going to add, just a different use case that I haven't heard so far. I have one client who built a manager coach. So it was basically, hey, manager, come here. If you want to practice the hard conversation with your employee, chat with the robot. And the robot pretends to be the employee. It was awesome. How good it, like, you basically tell it, like, this employee is going to be unhappy for these reasons. And it did a great job of asking the questions that employee would ask. So very specific use case, but super valuable because it made it so that you didn't have to train for all those edge cases, right? You could basically let managers self-serve that sort of practice experience. So I found that super helpful for that client. They found it helpful. The managers loved it. Lots of thumbs up usage when they deployed that in their annual cycle.
Yeah, I actually think that kind of thing kind of means the death of FAQs in the traditional sense as well. FAQs are always what historically we would do, right? When you get these questions, the Q&A from managers about, okay, why am I not high in my range? How do I get promoted, etc. But it's quite a binary way to look at it. It's much more fun to chat with ChatGPT, and it also kind of to some degree makes role playing defunct as well. I mean, role playing has always got a role to play, I think, no pun intended. but it means that managers can go in when they feel like it and when they have the time to do it, and just kind of role play exactly like you just said, Paul, and just practice those difficult conversations. And always say those conversations, they're like a muscle, like everything else. It just takes practice. Like no one likes the idea of those conversations, but once you've had a few, it just becomes something slightly normal and doesn't need to be quite as sensitive and difficult as everyone might think it is in the outset. But yeah, the ability to just go into ChatGPT and practice some of that stuff, I think it's just going to just make a whole bunch of other stuff we used to do defunct.
Can I just add one thing on the flip side of that? The most recent comp cycle that I ran, for the first time ever, we had to think about all of these AI possibilities and had to, in our manager enablement, we had to kind of let managers know, because our concern was that we might have managers going into ChatGPT, like open source AI models, and putting in things like, here's my budget, these are my employees, these are their performance ratings, like tell me how to, what kind of merit increases and equity and things like that to plan. And there's some merit to that, but obviously, like, we were concerned about confidential information or just sensitive information going out there, or just poor decision making based on what ChatGPT tells you to do versus using the guidelines that we painstakingly like put together and communicate. So so that was an interesting thing to now start thinking about as you're doing manager enablement and stuff that we never had to before. So yeah, something to keep in mind.
I love the idea or the use of AI as well to ask it what it needs to know from you. So you may say, I need to develop an incentive plan. What kind of things should I consider? And then tell you. And then kind of as you develop the plan, you can keep pushing questions to it and then having it execute and develop on those questions you've created. OpenAI recently, well, I guess today, they launched a new service called Canvas, and it's specifically designed for writing articles and coding. Previously in OpenAI, when you would make changes or create articles, you would have to essentially have it rewrite the whole article. What's really interesting about it now is you can select certain parts of that article, tell it to reword it, tell it to expand it, to constrict it, or to change the level of the degree which the complexity of the language it's using. So it's a really fascinating tool now that you can kind of, what else do you want to know from me? What else should I consider? Okay, great, now go write that. So it's a great tool in a couple of ways.
Yeah. And I don't know if you've tried that too much, Justin, but I do enjoy when you ask them questions about what you should consider for incentives. They usually tell you to consult with a compensation consultant. So I do enjoy that little, input that they have there for us. And then I think just to circle back quickly on Paul's point around customizing and tailoring just the broader ChatGPT to your levels, not only for informing job descriptions, but when we're working with highly acquisitive organizations that are consistently bringing on new talent and having to conform their legacy job titles, leveling scheme, understand the comp impact in a quick manner, that can also pay dividends, and getting that first pass done in an instance overnight, as opposed to having to spend, weeks managing your day job just to get a first pass to then validate. And so that has been very fruitful for a lot of clients that are highly acquisitive in that nature.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I think, let's move on to, I'm looking through there to see if there's any additional questions that have come through. I don't see any right now. But we do have...
Lauren Young asked one.
Oh.
Kind of toward the beginning. Let me go find it. Hang on. Can you share your insight on implementing new comp structures in large organizations? What does that look like? What does good look like in that situation? What are 2 or 3 things that comp teams and HR need to keep in mind when educating leaders? I've worked with some pretty big organizations prior to starting my own consulting firm. And, I always think anytime you're going to update something, you better tie it to a business case. Is there a business problem you're solving, or is there some sort of business goal that this is going to help support? And then 2, making sure that you consider the various factors that are that are needing to be balanced within an organization. Things like what is the organizational strategy and goals? What is your budget? Competitive pay benchmarking, pay transparency and pay equity, the concept of fairness and how employees view that, as well as the communications piece, right? Like, how are you going to train and support employees and managers as you make the changes? So I think it's really critical when you're working with a small or large organization that you tie it back to the organizational needs and how it's going to support achieving those.
Yeah.
And there's a specific question there as well, which is what does good look like? And it can, and my answer to that is it can look like, I'm not going to say the D word, but it can look like so many different things. These are different D word. And there are so many, we've all seen so many different ways to build comp structures and different types of leveling frameworks, lots of levels, fewer levels, different groupings, job-based ranges, traditional structures, level-based structures. And the thing is, they can all work. And if you took any one of those different structures and communicated it effectively and have people make comp decisions, you could very well end up with exactly the same set of decisions around compensation. They're just different ways to solve the same problem. So what does it look like? It looks like whatever you want it to look like, but what makes it work is how well it's communicated and understood, and to make sure there's no misunderstandings. Like,
Yeah.
You might think you're speaking the same language as someone, that you might think they understand, but if you've got a different concept of what a range is or how it should be used, or they're used to dividing the range into quarters instead of thirds or halves, and they don't, they're not used to midpoints or used to seeing a compa ratio, and you don't use, there are all kinds of ways that you can just alter the dialogue slightly. So it all just comes back down to compensation, communication for me, and making sure people understand how to use it.
And I think that translates to like what good looks like is getting buy-in across all of the different leaders in the organization and the employees that are now going to be managed through this system. And I think one of the key things to keep in mind when educating leaders is never underestimate the power of bringing people along for the ride early and often, so that you are aligning on what those key messages are, what the key changes are, and the downstream impacts around that, so that you have that buy-in early from your key stakeholders, you have the cross-functional support, and you're not just working in a silo. It helps, with all of the communications later on when you're truly rolling it out, to get that buy-in across the organization.
I agree. And I think one other thing that probably would apply here is the fact of going back to the compensation 101, and that is to ensure that there's an effective and current compensation policy in place that dictates where you're going to go, sort of utilizing it as a roadmap, and understanding also where the organization wants to go in terms of pay competitiveness, where you want to be in that lead lag, total rewards scenarios, how all that works, and from a total compensation perspective. It comes back again, I think, to strategy to some degree in terms of articulating what that is. And as you said, Bobby, making sure, and you too, James, making sure that it's articulated and you bring people along for the ride so they know what the end result's going to look like by the time you get there.
Yeah, plus. Oh,
go ahead.
Paul, you go ahead. I'll go after you.
Now I feel bad, Rekha. So Laura, I think that to your second specific question in there, around something to keep in mind when educating leaders. The larger the organization, keep in mind you have multiple leader personas, right? So what a manager cares about and how they will judge your new structure is different than like a mid-level manager, which is very different than a leader. And, make sure you're thoughtful about what's their motivation to change. What are they doing today that you're asking them to do differently? And then particularly for your most senior leaders who probably aren't making that many day-to-day decisions that are affected by your structure, they want to know what you're going to do if you got it wrong. Like, that's one of my sort of quick things we always toss out is, how will we know if we need the structure to change? Where is flexibility built in to the structure or to how we will change that structure, whatever that thing is that you are adopting? Because a CFO, a head of engineering just wants to make sure they can hire the people they need to hire. And if you're going to get in the way, how are you going to change it, right? So be upfront about that. But you don't have to share that with everybody. That's a leadership message, which is different than here are the rules we need you to follow at the manager level. So segment that leader population so that you're targeting the right content to the right type of leader. The larger the company, the more important that is.
I actually have a stakeholder analysis template that just gets to that. Who are the people who care and what do they care about and why? So if somebody wants that, just DM me on LinkedIn and I'll send you guys that. It is incredibly important. The other thing I think sometimes is missed in large companies is, the comp team will be busy doing things, but you got to work with talent development because these things integrate often with that. And I wrote a post about that recently. And then the other piece is, you should customize your communications and change management for each type of audience member, right? Like one size does not fit all because they all have different cares and concerns. And because we talk about compensation and it's an emotional topic, there's questions that aren't going to be asked in the room, right? Or on the call. So making sure that you have an avenue for people to ask questions one-on-one so that they can get questions asked so that because they may view themselves as just not knowing as much as everybody else, but give them a safe way to ask a question when it's not in the room.
Yeah, I'll just add one last thing and kind of plus one to what Bob was saying earlier. Having worked at a few large companies, I think what works is having a very well-defined compensation philosophy. And that's the time that you need buy-in from your leaders to set those very foundational point of view on compensation philosophy and communicating that. And then usually having 2 or 3 kind of aligned on guiding principles that help you in every decision. And there's just consistency in your programs that way, especially in large organizations, because if you're a global organization, you have multiple different countries with very different pay practices sometimes and different preferences and all of that. You have different functions, you have different, all kinds of levels of people working together, different generations in the workforce. So having that very consistent compensation philosophy, which your leaders are bought into and have been part of, developing it, as well as 2 or 3 guiding principles that drive your decision making is key in large organizations.
Okay. Great. That's a lot of really good feedback from the whole panel. All right, so I think there was another question that we saw not too long ago from Nirzari. So let's flag that one. And then let's see, that is the PPP concept. And let's see, let me actually highlight this one that actually kind of goes into and explains what PPP stands for. Because I was like, well, the Pay Practitioners Panel.
I was going to say, I saw PPP, I'm like, Pay Practitioners Panel. Yeah, we can talk about that. Purchasing clarity.
Yeah, Bobby, I think you had some thoughts on this one.
Yeah, so I think this is a question that's becoming much more common in just how global a lot of companies are today. I think the purchasing power parity, the factor is very beneficial, especially in countries that we don't necessarily have much good comp data in, but it doesn't necessarily have the full, story into that data point. That's really adjusting for the cost of living and how much it costs to purchase different things on a daily basis. A lot of our clients will prefer to use a cost of labor differential where it's available, because that's also taking into account the demand for the talent and those skill sets in that local labor market. And so it becomes a little bit more holistic. And so, not to throw another acronym at you with the COLA, but the COLA, where applicable, can be beneficial as well to expand on just the PPP.
I would also say the purchasing power parity, that's a lot to say, is made me immediately think of expats, right? Like if you're bringing somebody from the United States to do some work in Namibia or some other place. I worked in the mining industry for a while, and you wanted to keep purchasing power equitable with whatever their home country was. But to Bobby's point, you got to get really clear on, are you looking at that type of data? Are you looking at cost of labor, cost of living? There's all sorts of metrics and data sets out there. So you got to get really clear on what are you trying to deliver to the participants in your pay programs, and then get clear on which data set supports that.
It's interesting, and that's kind of why we started expanding this past year on Componomics. And it really ties into a lot of different variables, including cost of living, where you're geographically located, inflationary rates, wage growth, unemployment, employment, all those different things tend to play into a lot of the stuff that people want to know and have answers for. So that, and I'll give you a quick example. Back when inflation was 9% and being broadcast that way after COVID, and everybody's screaming, we got to do something. We got to jack everybody's rate because of inflation. I can't tell you, my phone was ringing off the hook. My first answer was, you never want to chase inflation, because guess what? It goes up and then it comes down. And especially if you're going to do any kind of adjustment at all, you certainly don't want to increase the base pay. You want to maybe do a differential or something like that, but don't increase the base. Well, they went ahead and increased the base, and 3 months later they're calling, well, inflation's now down to 4 and 5%. How do we take that away? And I said, how do you drive all your people away? You know, you gave them money and now you're going to take money away. That's going to go over like a lead balloon. You're going to lose your talent. So part of that whole economic base is going to be really interesting in the next couple of years, because the more we get fine-tuned into data and how that data is applied across all sorts of different places. And Justin, you know this with Squirrel, you can go into different geographic locations and get different answers for different things. From a global perspective, there's all sorts of other scenarios that you got to take into consideration. In some places, inflation's off the chart. Some places, purchasing power parity is off the chart. So, you know, and in other places, you wish you were there because you could save a ton of money. But, you know, normalization is going to be, I think, a key topic in 2025 and 2026, because I don't think anybody's got a true handle on it yet.
Yeah, it comes up a lot, and it tends to cost of labor versus cost of living, right? People argue for cost of living when that's going up a lot, and people argue for cost of labor when that's going up. It's cost of labor that should drive. It's just like everything in any goods and services in free market economics is driven by supply and demand, which is what cost of labor comes from. Like, just because inflation is going up doesn't mean there's any great, you know, it doesn't mean there's any need to pay any more for that resource. That's the kind of cold hard truth of it. So. And also, no one complained when inflation was at 1% and everyone was getting 3% merit budgets every year as well. So it goes both ways.
Exactly.
So that's one point there. And as we're talking about...
Oh, no. This was going to be a really good point.
Differentials. It's important to make sure that the differentials... Can you hear me okay? I've got a little yellow note there. Okay.
You're back. You're back.
It's important to know that the data that you use for those differentials should marry to the source of data that you're using for your benchmarking. Because if you look at like any of the geo-differential tools for any of the survey providers, you'll get very different numbers than you'll get from some of the publicly available resources, which tend to be much more pronounced because they tend to be driven by broader sets of industries and blue-collar jobs. So I've seen people trying to take like a set of tech data from a tech survey provider and apply public resources, geo-differentials, and you're going to massively overinflate the top end of that by applying a 25% Bay Area premium. Whereas if you go to that tech provider, the premium is probably going to be around 13 to 15% for the Bay Area. So you have the potential to significantly over or under pay if you don't use the geo-differentials from the same provider. And the other thing there, like, you know, it's worth bearing, like, international or non-US data can get kind of tricky as well, and that's been a problem over the last few years as there's been lots of exploration as to kind of offshore employee populations. And then you've got to be really careful as well. Like, you know, none of us here, I don't think, like the idea of using geo-differentials across borders, because that's fraught with problems. But a lot of the time the data is kind of lacking as well. And also a lot of the time when you take that non-US data from a US survey provider, it just tends to be what US multinationals pay in those locations, which doesn't necessarily reflect the local supply and demand for those employee populations. So a lot of the time that means then sourcing other data providers. So a lot of companies will have multiple data providers globally to make sure you're sucking up as much information as possible there.
It makes me think that, you know, a good comp person is skeptical. We ask a lot of questions about the data and does it fit, right?
Yeah, and I think too, you know, when we go back and ask those questions, I think we always have to come back to one question, and is, does this make us competitive? Does this help us pay competitively and fairly? Because at the end of the day, that's really where we need to end up. Is our job is not to align to a spreadsheet. It's to make sure we are creating competitive and fair wages for folks, amongst other things, of course. I think we've got time for one, maybe two more questions. So I'll move over now and we can talk through Angela's question. I think this is a great question. So what approaches have we seen trying to address wage gaps related to pay transparency reporting to, well, I butchered that question, but I think you guys know what the question actually is. Now, I think this is a great question. I actually saw a question like this not too long ago. I can't remember which forum. It may have been World at Work, where they were saying, how should we work with those employees who are red circled and green circled when they see that their pay is below the minimum or over the maximum? And boy, I always have a hard time seeing green circled employees who are being paid below the minimum. I think oftentimes we have to ask ourselves, is that the right person for the role? And if they are, why aren't we paying them the bare minimum that we said we would pay them? This is a hill I've died on a couple of times with some previous employers. And at the end of the day, I think that this is what pay transparency is for. It is to be open with what we're paying, but I would say in some ways to hold companies accountable to the ranges they have set for themselves and they are advertising to others. But I would be curious, what else have you folks seen in terms of how are you guiding your clients on rolling out pay transparency, addressing these kinds of questions? Denise, how about you?
There are so many things you can do. I think sometimes we forget that we have annual merit increase that time frame. We have market adjustments. Most organizations these days are thinking about, if not already doing, pay equity adjustments and having budget allocated for that. So you have multiple times a year to move things along. I think the most significant thing I have seen is employers, HR organizations struggling with getting the business case in front of senior leaders and having senior leaders agree with the pay transparency, pay equity kinds of actions they want to take. And then two, I've seen a fair number of folks just not have budget to fix things, right? So I think it has to become a business imperative. So again, you have to tie it to something pretty big that the business wants to achieve in order for them to allocate money and resources to it.
I think when sometimes chasing the ambulance in terms of lawsuits that are coming out across the country, you get a chance to talk to a plaintiff attorney about pay transparency and pay equity, they start salivating because there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there right now about the fact that people have not done that. And when you look at it from the standpoint of the talent wars a couple of years ago and everybody blowing up their comp systems because got to have the greatest and latest tech person or whatever else that's going to drive your company to the next millennium, it blew up a lot of comp systems. And as a result, folks like Google and IBM and some of the big companies have been slammed with huge pay equity issues that they lost. And you can only figure that going down as a trickle effect as the big companies either run and gun or do their needs to be able for risk management purposes. It's going to start flowing back into the mid smaller companies that did the exact same thing and don't have the systems in place to stay out of jail. So it's going to be really interesting, I think, in that regard.
So I'd just add on a couple of things to that. First thing is I'm with you, Justin. Every time, whether I'm in-house or whether I'm consulting with clients, always recommend bringing people into the band when you're basically starting out pay transparency and starting to post ranges or share ranges internally. I think that's like bare minimum. And if your leaders are aligned with the idea of being transparent on pay and bringing pay equity to your organization, hopefully they will be able to kind of put the money along that goes along with it, because you can't really do it correctly without that. But to me, pay transparency is about communication and literally transparency around communication. So honestly, whether you're in band, below band, above band, even if someone's within band, they're still going to have the same question: why am I in this position and range? Even if you bring people right at the starting point of the band, they're still going to say, why am I at the lowest point of this band? No matter where they are in the range, there's going to be questions. So it's more about being able to answer why someone is in the point that they're in. And then the following question is always going to be, how do I get up in range, right? And what does that mean for me next? So I think unlocking pay transparency is about enabling your managers to feel comfortable with these conversations, and almost think of this dialogue as an opportunity to have those very open conversations and to really discover the true motivations of your employees. And I feel like this is something we couldn't do in the past. And I think this is an amazing gift in a way. It's an opportunity in a way. So I think it's more about that, just having enough resources for managers to answer those questions, maybe using some of that AI coaching or whatever some of you mentioned earlier. So yeah, more than where you're in band, it's about answering, why am I here in this point in band, regardless of what that point might be.
I just want to add a really quick point in this one. I love that we're having all these problems, because that's the whole point of pay transparency. So all of these problems are better than what was there before, which was a whole bunch of hidden issues which were causing social and economic inefficiencies, but also holding businesses back because people are under incentivized and they just weren't aware of these problems. So I think it's just brilliant that we have all these problems. I know it creates a bit of extra work, but this is work that we should have been doing for years. So I think it's just a good thing.
Yeah, but just said we had to have legislation and laws that forced us to do what's the right thing, which is to just open the kimono and have the conversation. I think one of the best things I ever learned from a senior leader years ago was, they don't have to agree with what you say, but be open and transparent and honest. And they can not like what you're saying, but be open and tell the truth. I think too often and I have this habit too, we want to be liked, we want to please people, but some of these conversations aren't pleasing and they're very uncomfortable, but that's okay. They're good conversations to have, and it helps you build your muscle as a leader, and it helps you as an employee know what really matters to your organization, so you can move further in the range or get a promotion if that's your goal.
Yeah. And I have a colleague as well and we deal with a lot of skeptics as well around the benefits of pay transparency. And she's out of Finland, actually. And she always likes to tout Finland has complete pay transparency and they're the happiest country in the world. And so if there's not a correlation there, I'm not sure what else will resonate. But obviously also using some of Bob's examples of the lawsuits and the big, brand scrutiny with the Googles and others of the world with those lawsuits. It's the other direction of that argument, but ultimately brings you to the same place.
And Denise, I like the way you stopped where you said being very honest and transparent and everything else. And I think the key ingredient in that is then letting them decide the direction they want to go, because the minute you start telling them you've got to do this, is you've lost your credibility, because they're just going to kick you out the door. It's providing them, here's what you're looking at. This is what's going to happen to you if you don't, or if you do, and you got to sometimes leave it in the hands of the decision makers who are going to make the ultimate choice. And otherwise, if you dictate, it's a bad deal.
You can't dictate, and meeting them where they are, right? So I have one client right now where senior leaders, they can't even deal with some of the things that we've developed. They've got a lot of heightened emotions and big emotions and feelings about things. And we're like, holy cow, we got to strip all this that we were going to bring to the employee population back, because we've got to spend more time with the senior leadership team to get them to understand why we're doing what we're doing and the process steps and so forth related to pay decisions, so that they don't take their emotional big feelings forward into the population, because there's already some mistrust and some cultural things within the organization that could go sideways. So you got to meet people where they're at.
Yep.
Well, great. Well, that puts us at the top of the hour. Thank you, Denise, Bobby, Shari, Bob, James, Rekha, and Paul. Again, if you like something you heard, or if you've got challenges and what someone on the panel said resonates with one of the challenges you have, we're all consultants. We are all happy to talk to you about any problems or challenges you may have. But again, we're happy just to sit here and talk chop, and hope you enjoyed it too. We'll have another one, same group, same time, and 2 weeks from now. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Really appreciate the time. And with that, we will sign off as soon as I find there it is. As soon as I find the button. All right.